The Vietnam War was not misunderstood, it was misrepresented. There is a difference between confusion and concealment, and the men who fought in Southeast Asia learned early that the gap between what happened and what was reported was not an accident. It was policy. This is not a story about brave soldiers or tragic mistakes. This is about a war that continued long after its architects stopped believing in it, and the realities those soldiers were told to bury. When American combat units began arriving in Vietnam in significant numbers in 1965, they were issued rules of engagement that changed depending on who was asking. Official documents outlined restrictions on when to fire, how to identify combatants, and what constituted a legitimate target. Unofficial guidance from officers who had been in country longer was different. It acknowledged that the enemy did not wear uniforms, that villages were often complicit, and that waiting for positive identification could mean death. Soldiers learned quickly that survival required ignoring the written rules, but any mistake would be judged by those same rules afterward. This contradiction was never resolved. It was simply accepted. The body count became the primary metric of progress in 1967. Commanders needed numbers to send up the chain. Higher headquarters needed numbers to justify the war to Washington. Washington needed numbers to justify the war to the public. The problem was that counting bodies in a jungle war where the enemy removed their dead was nearly impossible. So the numbers were estimated, then inflated, then fabricated. A unit might call in 10 enemy killed in action based on blood trails and probable hits. By the time the report reached Saigon, it was 20. By the time it reached the Pentagon, it was 30. No one questioned it, because everyone needed the numbers to go up. Soldiers knew this. They watched officers who cared more about their next promotion than accurate reporting. They saw how a firefight with uncertain results could be written up as a decisive victory. They learned that the war was being measured by a metric that had no connection to reality. Free fire zones were areas where anyone encountered could be considered hostile and engaged without warning. These zones were marked on maps and briefed to units, but the civilian population living in those areas was rarely informed or evacuated. Farmers working rice paddies, children herding livestock, and elderly villagers who had lived in the same place for generations were all reclassified as combatants by military cartography. Soldiers were ordered to treat these areas as enemy territory. When they killed civilians in a free fire zone, it was not considered a war crime. It was considered an enemy kill. The distinction existed only on paper. In practice, entire regions of South Vietnam were designated as places where human life had no protected status. This was never publicly explained. The Phoenix program was a CIA-led initiative to identify and neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure. Neutralize meant capture, interrogate, or kill. The program relied on intelligence from South Vietnamese informants who were often settling personal scores or eliminating business rivals. Suspects were detained without trial, interrogated using methods that included electric shock, water torture, and prolonged stress positions, and in many cases executed. American advisors oversaw this process. Some participated directly. The program claimed to have neutralized over 26,000 individuals by 1969, but there was no verification process and no accountability for false accusations. Soldiers assigned to Phoenix knew they were operating outside the Geneva Conventions. They were told it was necessary. They were told not to discuss it. Fragging was the practice of killing or attempting to kill an officer or non-commissioned officer, usually with a fragmentation grenade. It became common enough that the term entered military slang. Between 1969 and 1972, there were over 800 documented fragging incidents. The actual number was higher because many incidents were covered up or attributed to enemy action. Soldiers fragged officers who were too aggressive and likely to get their men killed. They fragged officers who were too cautious and extended tours by avoiding combat. They fragged officers who enforced discipline and officers who were incompetent. The act itself was an acknowledgement that the chain of command had collapsed in some units. Men were no longer willing to die for objectives they did not believe in, under leaders they did not trust. The military did not know how to address this without admitting the war had lost its coherence. Herbicide operations were publicly described as a way to deny the enemy cover and destroy crops that fed Viet Cong units. Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants were sprayed over millions of acres. The military was aware by the mid-1960s that these chemicals caused severe health effects. Internal studies documented increases in cancer rates, liver damage, and birth defects among exposed populations. These findings were classified. Soldiers who handled the chemicals were not given protective equipment. Pilots who flew spray missions were told the substances were harmless. Villages downwind of sprayed areas experienced sudden increases in stillbirths and deformities. American personnel who raised concerns were reassured by medical officers reading from approved statements. The long-term effects were not unknown. They were deliberately concealed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was described in press briefings as a simple footpath that could be interdicted with sufficient bombing. In reality, it was a sophisticated logistics network spanning multiple countries, with underground fuel storage, vehicle repair facilities, anti-aircraft defenses, and rest stations. Thousands of tons of supplies moved down the trail every month, despite constant American airstrikes. Pilots flew mission after mission against the same sections of road, watching them get repaired within days. Ground units that encountered North Vietnamese soldiers found them well equipped with ammunition, medicine, and food. The bombing campaign against the trail was presented as effective. Reconnaissance showed it was not. The campaign continued anyway because there was no alternative strategy, and stopping would mean admitting failure. The drug epidemic in American units began in the late 1960s and accelerated rapidly. Marijuana was widespread and considered relatively harmless. Heroin became common by 1970. In some units, more than a third of enlisted men used heroin regularly. The drug was cheap, pure, and readily available from South Vietnamese suppliers who operated with the knowledge of local authorities. Soldiers used it to manage fear, boredom, and disillusionment. Officers knew and in many cases did nothing because addressing the problem would require documenting the scale of addiction, which would reflect poorly on command. Units that should have been combat-ready were barely functional. The official narrative maintained high morale and operational effectiveness. Soldiers who returned home carried addictions that would follow them for decades. Search and destroy missions were designed to locate and eliminate enemy forces. In practice, they often meant moving through hostile territory, making contact, calling in artillery and airstrikes, and withdrawing. The same areas were swept repeatedly. The same villages were searched over and over. The enemy would retreat, wait for American forces to leave, and return. There was no terrain to hold because the strategy was not based on territorial control. It was based on attrition. Soldiers walked through jungles and rice paddies knowing they were bait. The goal was to provoke an attack so firepower could be brought to bear. Men died to generate contact. Whether the contact achieved anything beyond a body count number was irrelevant to the mission structure. The South Vietnamese government was described as an ally defending freedom. It was a military dictatorship sustained by American money and threats. Elections were controlled. Political opponents were jailed or killed. Corruption reached every level of administration. American aid intended for refugee relief or infrastructure was siphoned off by officials. South Vietnamese army units were unreliable, often refusing to engage the enemy or abandoning positions. Soldiers saw this firsthand. They watched ARVN soldiers sit back while Americans took casualties. They saw supplies sold on the black market. They understood the government they were supporting had no legitimacy and no popular support. This was never acknowledged in official assessments. The fiction of South Vietnamese partnership was maintained until the end. Civilian casualties were systematically undercounted. When an airstrike hit a village, the report would list structures destroyed and enemy casualties. Civilian deaths would be mentioned as possible or unavoidable. Artillery fire called in on suspected enemy positions often landed on populated areas. The default assumption was that anyone in a combat zone was enemy or enemy adjacent. Soldiers who witnessed mass civilian deaths in operations were told the deaths were regrettable but consistent with the rules of engagement. After-action reports were sanitized. Investigations were rare and usually exonerated the units involved. The occasional massacre that reached public attention was treated as an aberration. It was not. It was the logical outcome of a war where the enemy was indistinguishable from the population and success was measured in bodies. Psychological operations included not just leaflets and broadcasts, but falsified incidents designed to manipulate perceptions. Dead Viet Cong were sometimes arranged in positions to look like atrocities committed by other Viet Cong to turn the population against them. Captured documents were altered or fabricated to suggest internal divisions in enemy ranks. Some operations involved planting evidence of North Vietnamese aggression to justify escalations. Soldiers involved in these activities understood they were creating propaganda, not documenting reality. The line between information and deception dissolved. Truth became a tool rather than a standard. The policy of Vietnamization was presented as a plan to transition responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew. In reality, it was a face-saving mechanism to allow American exit regardless of conditions on the ground. South Vietnamese units were not becoming more capable. They were being given responsibility they could not handle because the American public would no longer tolerate casualties. Soldiers training ARVN forces knew the transition was doomed. They knew the South Vietnamese military would collapse without American support. They were told to present optimistic assessments anyway. The goal was not success. The goal was plausible deniability. Soldiers wrote letters home that were read by censors. Anything too critical, too detailed about operations, or too demoralizing was redacted or delayed. The image of the war that reached American families was curated. Soldiers learned to write in generalities. They learned to lie about their well-being. They learned that honesty had consequences. Some stopped writing entirely. The separation between what was happening and what could be said created a psychological isolation. Men could not process their experiences because they could not articulate them honestly, even to the people who cared about them. The idea that drug use was primarily an enlisted problem ignored the fact that officers and senior NCOs also used alcohol and stimulants to cope. Amphetamines were distributed to pilots flying extended missions. Officers drank heavily in fortified compounds while their men used heroin in the field. The military's response to addiction focused on punishing lower-ranking personnel while ignoring or protecting those higher in the chain of command. The double standard was obvious. It reinforced the belief that rules applied differently depending on rank, and that the institution was more interested in appearances than solutions. After the Tet Offensive in 1968, it became clear that years of optimistic assessments had been false. The enemy was not weakened. They were capable of coordinated large-scale attacks across the entire country. American commanders had been claiming progress based on body counts and pacified villages. None of it mattered. The strategic situation had not changed. Soldiers who had been told they were winning watched the same enemy reappear in strength. The credibility of leadership evaporated. Orders were still followed, but belief was gone. Short-timer syndrome affected soldiers as their tour neared its end. Men became risk-averse, refusing dangerous missions or finding ways to avoid combat. This was rational. Surviving 11 months only to die in the 12th because of someone else's ambition was unbearable. Units lost cohesion as individuals prioritized survival over mission accomplishment. Officers could not counter this because they understood it. The one-year rotation policy meant units never stabilized. There was no institutional memory, no continuity, and no shared purpose beyond enduring until departure. The concept of winning became meaningless. There was no front line to advance, no capital to capture, no surrender to negotiate. The enemy could lose every battle and still win the war by outlasting American commitment. Soldiers understood this intuitively. They fought because they were ordered to, but not because they believed their efforts would lead to victory. The war continued because stopping required admitting it had been a mistake. The machinery of deployment, supply and casualty processing kept functioning even as the rationale disappeared. Soldiers were told that discussing certain operations, certain casualties and certain command failures was a matter of national security. They were told that revealing the truth would aid the enemy. They were told their silence was patriotic. Most complied, not out of conviction, but out of exhaustion. Speaking required reliving. It required making others understand something that could not be understood from a distance. Silence was easier. For many, it became permanent. In 1973, American combat forces withdrew. The war continued for 2 more years without them. The South Vietnamese government collapsed in 1975. Everything that soldiers had been told to fight for ceased to exist. The dead remained dead for a cause that was abandoned. The veterans returned to a country that did not want to hear what they had seen. The silence that began as policy became a condition. The casualty reports filed in April 1975, as Saigon fell, included South Vietnamese personnel who were still listed as allies. The paperwork continued even as the cause it documented was erased.